Hi, I'm Iva Davies from Icehouse, and you're on Noise 11.
Iva Davies, Icehouse. Welcome back.
Thank you.
And a compilation album, White Heat, is what we're going to be talking about today. And there have been greatest hits of Icehouse in the past, but they've never been complete, have they?
No, in fact, they've been quite incomplete. I think we only ever got to about the fourth album. And certainly there are a great number of music videos that have never ever been available anywhere. And that was one of the... I wanted an opportunity to get those out, and this was, the perfect opportunity. So very interesting trying to put all that together. And Keith Welsh and I, obviously co-founder of the band, and working together with him, and we for a little while looked at the idea of mucking around with the track listing and so on and so forth. And in the end, I think we looked at each other and just went, you know what, we're just going to put this out as a chronological document. Which is what it is.
I remember going to a lot of Icehouse gigs through the 80s, and it was always interesting that your set list was always singles then too. And I sort of remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, but around the time of Man of Colours, as another single would be released, then that would be added to the set. Then another single would be released, and that would be added to the set.
It's an interesting observation. I've not had anybody make that observation before, but it's... It gets tricky, because when there are 30 songs that have performed in the top 40 or whatever, to actually choose what to do and what not to do, and then inevitably, of course, somebody will say, "Oh, can you do this obscure album track from whenever," which actually might be a personal favourite of mine to play, or might be a great thing for the band to play, but won't be necessarily as well known. So it gets very difficult.
Let's go through the tracks on this record. We've got 30 songs here, but we'll summarise it down. I'd just be interested to find what are your personal favourites. What was a difficult one to write? What was one that you may not have thought should have been a single but was? And even something that may have never been played. And we'll start off with the very first single, "Can't Help Myself."
That first collection, of course, that first album, were songs that were written on the road. Virtually, they were trial over many performances before we got anywhere near recording them. In fact, I was doing things like changing the lyrics. They were evolving from night to night. But "Can't Help Myself," and they were the first 10 songs really that I'd written. And "Can't Help Myself" was the very last one, most recent one I'd written. And it seemed every time I went to the record company and to the producer, Cameron Allen, with a new song, they said, "Oh, well, that'll be a single." And I brought "Can't Help Myself" along, and "Oh, well, that'll be the first single." And so it was very interesting that it seemed that I was getting better at writing songs. And so it was interesting for me to now look at the fact that that was, at the time, the most recent thing I'd written.
We Can Get Together, seeing the band a few weeks ago, and watching the crowd reaction to that song. That was the sing-along song of the night, wasn't it?
We Can Get Together is a great fun song to play live, and partly because I constructed it around a guitar, and even though I'm a guitarist, I don't write songs around the guitar, but it's one of those things that falls under your hand and plays itself, so they're a joy to play.
I think we got the FM years started around the same time as that first Icehouse album. "Walls" was one of those songs that was all over FM radio, wasn't it?
Yeah, I remember clearly this was the first... Some of the early songs I collaborated with our first keyboard player, but this was... it was inevitable I was going to have to write songs, and I remember very clearly didn't have a clue. And very recently I came across a set of notebooks, and within the notebooks, believe it or not, were all the early lines that ended up forming the lyrics to "Walls." And I don't keep diaries, I don't write in notebooks, but I made a concerted effort to start trying to work out how to write songs, and the process for that was putting all these odd phrases in that ended up being "Walls."
Now the track Icehouse, of course you were called Flowers when that one came out.
Icehouse was one of the earliest of those very particular moments where a piece of technology completely dictated terms to me. We had bought this new string synthesizer, I brought it home, stayed up all night with it and a tape recorder, and by the morning I had the entire song. And it was purely a byproduct of having this new gadget to play with.
Love in Motion was a single that sort of got added to later versions of the first album, but originally it was just sort of in between album 1 and 2, wasn't it?
It was the only song I've ever written on the road. We were in the middle of that first international tour. We were staying in London when the management said to me, "We need to go and send you into a studio with a new song." I don't work like that at all. But apparently I work well under pressure. I remember I was still writing the lyrics in the taxi on the way to the studio. That's how close I came to missing the deadline.
The other version of that with Chrissy Amphlett came a while later.
Much later, and it's interesting too because Love and Motion was a very particular exercise for me to write a song that was based around a groove. That was what made that song work. And I think Bill Laswell, who produced the Chrissy Amphlett version, went straight to that whole key element of the song and based his version around the groove entirely as well, and tried to get as smoky and as soulful a performance out of Chrissy Amphlett, and he did.
Moving on to the Primitive Man album, and Great Southern Land is one of those songs that's pretty much become an anthem, hasn't it?
And a constant surprise to me because it was the first song that I wrote in that collection of songs. What possessed me to attempt such an important subject, I don't know, because I'm a very conservative writer. But I do remember being very aware that if I made a mess of it, if I, wrote a shoddy piece of lyrics for this particular subject, that it would come back to bite me forever. And luckily, thankfully, I think I managed to, that fear and loathing produced a reasonable result.
Hey Little Girl, another massive hit for Icehouse.
Hey Little Girl was a complete surprise because it was a total afterthought. It was at the point when the whole album was finished, the American record company said to me that classic A&R line, "We don't hear a single, go back and write some more songs." And in fact, I wrote it in Giorgio Moroder's house in the Hollywood Hills. And it was a completely rambling piece of tape that was 7 minutes long. And in fact, the whole thing is entirely constructed by editing.
What about Street Cafe, another sizable hit for the band?
Street Cafe was a real labour. It was one of the songs that I had. Most of the songs were completed very quickly as recordings, and I had one which didn't have a set of lyrics, and that was Street Cafe. It took me weeks and weeks and weeks to finish it off. It was one of the greatest exercises in procrastination you can imagine. But eventually I did finish it.
Yeah. Glam, dedicated to glam. This is the throwback to my old Eon FM days. It's ageing me here, but that was very Bowie-esque.
It was. It was actually in that period in Giorgio Moroder's house again, where I was trying to add final bits to the album, and rather than Bowie, I every now and again, and I've done this a number of times, wanted to go back to Mark Bolan and write something with a guitar riff and something quite simple, and I got to a certain point with it as a song where I thought, it's half instrumental and it's half song. I'm just going to leave it there. And that's where it landed. It was a bit of a hybrid.
On to the next album, and Taking the Town, back to a rock and roll Icehouse, wasn't it?
It was. It was a fun period of technology for me because I was using the Fairlight, which was it was great to work with. And yes, every now and again, the original kind of ethic of the band as a pub rock punk band came out, and that was I wanted to write a song with attitude, and that was what came out of it.
Everyone has a particular favourite Icehouse song. For me, Don't Believe Anymore is always been my favourite Icehouse song, with that killer sax from Joe Camilleri.
Yeah, it was one of those strange incidents. I tried, and I still do, try not to write my own diary in my own songs, and of course fail miserably at it. And I remember that was a very, very personal song for me at the time, but I didn't tell anybody about what was going on in my life. And it was years later when the lead guitarist said, well, I remember when you were in the studio singing that song, and I knew immediately there was something terribly wrong in your life. And I said, I didn't think anybody actually had picked that up.
What about Dusty Pages?
Now, Dusty Pages was one of the very few songs I've written on a guitar, and it was quite a deliberate attempt to get back to that sort of folk acoustic basis. Of course, it turned into an Icehouse keyboard extravaganza, as they all did, but every now and again I have gone back to an acoustic guitar and tried just writing almost in a Bob Dylan manner, and that's what came out of that exercise.
Right. And jumping through the years here, we're into another album, No Promises.
That particular album was written in parallel with a ballet that I was commissioned to write for the Sydney Dance Company. And the way that we worked was we'd spend 3 days writing a bit of ballet music, and then we'd spend 3 days writing a song, and then we alternated. Inevitably, the two projects bled into one another. So actually, No Promises was originally within the ballet, but of course we decided it was a good song, and so we extracted it and re-recorded it for the album.
Baby You're So Strange, another rocker.
Once again, going back to Mark Bolan and his kind of half nonsensical, amusing lyric style, and at that time, of course, we had Simon Lloyd playing sax with us, and so I wanted to kind of amalgamate a kind of Bolan simplicity with a big band, and that was the result. Was Baby You're So Strange.
And then Mr. Big was the next one.
And Mr. Big was. I think heavily added to by David Lord, the producer, because he was never satisfied with the sounds that I brought him in the demos. He always wanted to play around with and enhance them. So Mr. Big is full of gadgetry. It's actually very much a showcase for David Lord, the producer.
What about Cross the Border?
Cross the Border, for me, I have incredible affection for because of the way of what happened when we were recording it. We were recording it in London. So happened that Brian Eno was living across the square from where we were recording, and knew obviously Rhett Davies. He'd worked with Rhett Davies as a producer on the early Eno solo albums. And through an introduction to Brian Eno, I ended up standing at a microphone singing the backing vocals to Cross the Border with Brian Eno. So that was quite a moment for me.
Yeah. The Man of Colours album came out. That cracked the band just wide open worldwide. Big tours of America. The first song off that was Crazy.
Yeah, Crazy is I have a special affection for because I think it's a song that worked really hard. We did a lot of work with Measure for Measure, the previous album, and we toured America, and we toured very hard, and we had a number of songs that got into the top 50, so they were kind of knocking on the door of success without having got there. But Crazy, I watched blaze a trail up the American charts until a point where I got a phone call from John Woodruff, our manager, saying, well, it's got into the top 20, it's now number 14. And I think it really set the stage for the single which followed it to be a bigger success.
Well, that was Electric Blue, and it was a big success due in part to the co-write that you had with John Oates.
John Oates is a man who clearly knows a hit where I didn't. In fact, if you asked me the question, what would you vote the song least likely to succeed, and it probably would have been Electric Blue. At the point at which we had finished working on it as much as we were going to, he came out to Australia for a week. It was a very unfinished song. There were large gaps in it. I had certain bits of melody line. We had the title. We had a couple of lines like "All Over You" and so on. But at that point, even when in a skeletal form, John Oates said to me, "This will be a hit. You make sure you record it. If you don't, Hall & Oates will, and we'll put it out as a single, and it will be a hit."
Yeah.
And he knew.
Did you ever perform that song with him?
I did, on the stage of Madison Square Garden.
And maybe again in 2012?
Well, that's a thought, isn't
it? Maybe. We'll hold that thought. My Obsession.
My Obsession was a rare kind of excursion for me into the area of soul. It's not by any stretch of the imagination a soul song, but it was a style that we'd had nothing to do with, and I wouldn't refer to as an influence of me. But for some reason, I wanted to kind of stray into that area a little bit, and that was what the exercise of My Obsession was.
And the haunting Man of Colours title track, another personal favourite of mine.
And of mine, because one of those very rare moments Keith Richard talked in his book about, and other songwriters will tell you, there have probably been a couple of gifts in their life. And Man of Colours was a song that was written in an hour. It really did feel as if somebody had just given it to me. And in that sense, it's very special, but it's also very special in the sense that it was also semi-autobiographical as well. And so those two things, I think, possibly would make it my favourite song.
Now, one of the ones that I probably didn't take a lot of notice with back in the day, but when I saw the band a few weeks ago and you performed this one, I was amazed by the reaction again. Nothing Too Serious.
Nothing Too Serious is great fun to play live. And probably because I remember very specifically Bob and I in the studio really sitting down and going, let's just do something fun and mad and stupid, and the whole idea that I had was, I woke up with a hangover, and it's a scene from the apocalypse. It's just so that first verse is 20-story buildings falling down on me, mountain ranges sliding into the sea, rivers of blood. That was the whole idea was in that first verse.
Now, a couple more tracks that weren't specifically on albums, but made a greatest hits. Touch the Fire.
Touch the Fire was in between albums, and I remember very clearly I'd changed my technology at that point, and it was the first thing I did on a new setup. But I remember at the time when I finished it, I was very excited by the song. I remember driving to see my manager with this cassette, which is what we had in those days, to say, "Look, listen to this, listen to this, listen to this," and of course went back into the studio with David Lord, who'd we done Man of Colours and Measure for Measure with. So it's very much related to that whole period of his production.
Jimmy Dean was another track off that album.
And a song inspired by a photograph, really. I think, I don't know where the thought came from, but there is a particular photograph of James Dean, and I think he's on Broadway in New York. It's a rainy day. He's got a greatcoat on and his collar pulled up around his ears, and he's in this drizzling rain. And it's an iconic photograph, but the thing that I get out of the photograph was what's going on in his head. So I wrote a song, which is really me projecting on what might have been going on in his head.
And then onto another album, launched with Big Fun.
Big Fun was, I guess, to a sense, me exploiting our drummer, Paul Wheeler, who's a fantastic drummer, but of course every now and again lapses into John Bonham, Led Zeppelin madness, and of course I had to tap into that. So Big Fun is really going back to my high school days of what I was listening to back then, which would have been Jimmy Page and John Bonham and a whole lot of old heavy rock and roll.
And then Mr. Vine came along, another sizable hit for the band.
And Mr. Vine was, once again, a different exercise for me. I think inspired by Bob Dylan, of all people, because one thing I'd never written was one of those incredibly vitriolic songs, that sort that Bob Dylan did so perfectly well in songs like a Rolling Stone, How Do You Feel? Of course, Mr. Vine didn't turn out with anything like the class that Dylan's songs of that nature did, but I wanted to have that attitude in the song.
Anything is possible.
Anything is Possible was probably the most reworked song of my entire catalogue. It was the only time, for example, I've actually written an entire song, recorded the whole of it, then thrown out everything except the chorus line, which was Anything is Possible, rewritten all the verses, everything again, totally re-recorded it. I just don't do that sort of thing. So it's a very reworked piece of work.
Yeah, we're sort of getting to the end of part one of Icehouse, because part two is now. But, moving on to the next track, Satellite.
The Big Oil album was an interesting experiment because I worked with two other guys. We spent the whole time together, we worked the whole time together, and we drove the whole thing from one particular idea. And as odd as it sounds, we decided right at the beginning, when we were discovering what great, interesting things we could get happening by turning a sound sample backwards, that we were going to write the whole album backwards. Satellite was, in fact, a very standard guitar riff, which, once it was turned around backwards, turned into something we thought was incredibly remarkable, and it really was the basis for our whole song.
And Big Wheel.
Big Wheel was the first song that I wrote with David, who ended up working with myself and our drummer Paul for the whole album. And David is somebody who's probably even more particular about things than I am. I think it was this very introductory process that introduced me to the fact that David was going to be a complete perfectionist, but that we had a lot of common territory, and I'm actually very proud of the song Big Wheel that resulted from that.
And Invisible People, I guess, was officially the final single, wasn't it?
It was, and the Big Wheel album is a very rough piece of work, there's no doubt about it. That was part of the exercise, I guess. Whether or not that failed or succeeded is questionable, but as a song, Invisible People, I think, is a set of lyrics I'm glad I wrote. I would attribute it to the part of me that loves John Lennon, that wants to get a message out. And I don't preach very often, but Invisible People is the homage to the unspoken heroes of society.
And not only is White Heat the album, all of the audio, but all of the videos in chronological order, and we see varying degrees of hairstyle
and various fashion statements. I think that one of the reasons I want to make this this set available is because they've never been available as a complete set before, but also it was a very interesting historical time because you can map the beginnings of the band and these first music videos to really the invention of the music video and the invention of the whole MTV audience, which was a revolution. It changed the 80s completely. And so it produced great talent in directors. It produced some real heroes, some remarkable figures. Russell Mulcahy did a number of clips for us. And at that point, he was the king of music videos. And really, it's interesting for me to watch because I had very little input into any of these things. I let the directors run with whatever they wanted to, and sometimes they were ghastly failures, and sometimes they were quite extraordinary. But I don't have any problem even with what I'm wearing because I didn't choose it. So I just let these people do what they do. I do, once I'd written a song and recorded the song, that was my bit finished.
Yeah. So will we see another instalment of Primitive Man? Is that going to be the next project?
Ultimately, we've unearthed such a lot of material that really any opportunity we can have to attach some of that to re-releasing the original albums will be welcome. I think it would be a great shame if some of this material was to perish in a cupboard somewhere. So yes, the answer to that is yes.
Well, we look forward to the next exciting chapter in the Icehouse story. No doubt coming in 2012. Iva Davies, good to have you back in.
Thanks.
Thanks.